Good morning. Today we are going to talk about the question of tribes in India. The learning objectives of this particular module is to acquaint the students with tribes as a social category in India, to appraise them of the debates around tribes and caste, to understand the changes in the condition of the tribes, and to document the current trends in some of the tribes in India today. Until the 1930s and the 40s, anthropology as a discipline remained concerned about small-scale pre-literate societies of sub-Saharan Africa, Melanesia, Australia and South America, where tribal population was in a large concentration. Anthropologists also made a contribution to the study of civilizations in India, although tribes were considered to be outside civilizations. Now, a tribe can be understood as a form of social organization organized in the form of bands having temporary or permanent political integration and defined by common descent, language, and culture. It is said that the term tribe originated in ancient Rome. The term tribus denoted a division within a state. It later came to be used as a way to understand cultures which were explored as a result of their encounter with European civilization. By 19th century, many anthropologists and culture scholars use the term tribes to denote groups or societies interchangeably by referring to them as bands, chiefdoms, state, which were in a particular stage of unilineal cultural evolution. Now, the question of categorizing tribes in Indian society arose with the British. The British administrators found an impetus to not only create lists for intervention, as a result of which in the 1930s lists came to be drawn up by granting them certain administrative and political concessions. As a result of this classification, some tribe came to be considered as a tribe in one region, whereas not a tribe in another region. Now, a notable feature of the British administration was that they were not interested only in enumerating but also in classification, especially by 1931 when J.H. Hutton had taken over as the Census Commissioner in India. The debate around what is a tribe and how is it to be demarcated from caste was rife, and it continues even after independence. So, groups which were closer to worshipping Hindu gods were characterized as Hindus, and those which were animistic in nature were considered or treated as a tribe. The definition of a tribe is very difficult today, as it is very difficult to find features which are typically tribal in any tribe. The process of absorption of tribals has been going on for centuries, and most tribes today express some degree of continuity or the other with the larger Hindu society. However, an attempt is being made to delineate the features of what constitutes a tribe. A tribal society is characterized by the presence of segmentary political systems. That is, they do not have a centralized authority. The balance of the social system is maintained by the balance of power of the units. A tribe is characterized by a common language or a dialect which demarcates it from other tribes. A tribe again differs from modern society by virtue of the processes of differentiation and specialization. Now, among the tribes, differentiation is in terms of more biological in nature, in terms of age, sex and kinship, whereas specialization is more functional in terms of certain skills like the priests, the medicine man or the shaman, or the tribal chief. Tribal societies are relatively unstratified, especially when we compare it to caste societies. There is a division of labor, but there is no value uh, judgment attached to the nature of tasks that are performed by different people within a particular tribe. Members of a tribe are related by the ties of kinship. In fact, the ties of kinship are so strong that those who are not members, unless they are adopted as a kin, they cannot be treated as members of a particular tribe. Similarly, members of a tribe are typically said to share common name and a contiguous territory to work in collective pursuits like agriculture, warfare, ceremonial activities, house construction, and so on. India has probably the largest concentration of tribal population in the country, which is about 8.6% of the total population. Apart from its large size, what characterizes the tribals in our society is its enormous diversity. The tribes are quite unevenly distributed to the extent that the share of the tribal population in some of the regions varies from 94% to less than 1%. It is a popular view that they live in forests, but tribes are also found to live in cities and towns. Nearly 3/4 of the Adivasi population is concentrated in regions like Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Maharashtra, West Bengal, Bihar, and such regions. But barring Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, where the proportion of the tribal population is quite substantial, they are not able to exercise any significant influence on the processes of political and social decisions. The tribal languages in India belong to different sources of origin, namely the Austric languages, the Tibeto-Chinese family of languages, the Dravidian and the Indo-Aryan families. Nearly 116 tribal languages and tribal dialects exist. Most of the tribal population is multilingual. Over years of interaction with the mainstream population, they have converted to Hinduism, Christianity, and Buddhism, Islam, and have moved away from their tradition of work. This has not only affected their linguistic capabilities, but it has also affected their thought patterns. So, there is an attempt to shun the use of the mother tongue, but if one shuns the use of the mother tongue, one stands to lose one's identity. Next, we come to the debate on tribes and castes. Now, anthropologists and sociologists find that there is no single way of making a classification to define the tribes. Andre Bethe proposes to follow N.K. Bose's classification, who divided tribes on the basis of language, religion, and forms of kinship. Bethe added one more dimension to this classification, that is, the primary ways in which they make a living. Now, N.K. Bose divided tribes into 5 categories, namely hunter-gatherers, shifting cultivators, settled agriculturists using the plow, nomadic cattle keepers, workers in plantations and industries who have been recruited from their ranks. F.G. Bailey rejects the above classification as he feels that none of the classification of N.K. Bose is sociological. He says the geographical isolation cannot be applied uniformly to all tribes in a very strict manner. There is no distinctive tribal language, according to Bailey. Many tribes speak a dialect of certain mainstream languages. For example, Mundas and Oraons speak different dialects, whereas there are others like the Bhumij who have lost their tribal dialect and now use a dominant language of the area. As far as religion is concerned, it is easy to show that tribal religion has elements of Hindu religion and values. Conversely, among Hindus of the lower castes too, one is likely to find this kind of intermingling and interchange of elements from different religions. Gurye in fact called the tribals backward Hindus, differing only to some extent from each other, from other segments of society. F.G. Bailey was the only anthropologist who made a serious attempt to distinguish tribes and caste in structural terms. He warned us against any attempt by particular societies to classify themselves as either tribes or castes and suggests that they should be viewed as a continuum. In fact, the tribe caste continuum is a creation of F.G. Bailey. According to him, the larger the proportion of a society which has direct access to land is closer to the tribal end of the continuum. Conversely, the proportion of people whose right to land is achieved through a dependent relationship, that particular segment of tribal population is said to be closer to becoming castes. For example, in Kandhamal, the relation to land is very different from Kandhas and Odiyas. For the Kandhas, everybody who is a part of the Kandha tribe, who is related to each other by ties of kinship, are Kandhas, and therefore they can own land. As far as the Odiyas are concerned, this transformation is brought about by practices of subordination and hierarchy, which are seen in caste Hindu society, subordination to members of the dominant castes. So, Louis Dumas feels that F.G. Bailey's tribe caste continuum is a little simplistic, and he says that Bailey identifies only one aspect, and that is ownership of land as a way of belonging to either end of the continuum. But Louis Dumas says that there are many other dimensions which may bring about this transformation from tribe to caste, and they could be included. The continuum, in fact, he says, can be looked upon as a multidimensional link between the two extreme stages. Caste society is considered to be organic and hierarchical, while tribal society is considered to be segmentary and egalitarian. A segmentary society is small in scale, and it represents a definite structural type, which is different from the more complex social system of the caste Hindu societies, where the peasantry and the gentry coexist. By this definition, according to Bete, Santhals, Mundas and Oraons correspond less to the tribes and more to the peasants. Tribes and castes should be looked upon as structures or institutional complexes which are there as choices for individuals in particular societies. But then, how does a tribe become a caste? Tribes and castes are not so much a continuum as an alternative way of acting. They can be looked upon as seeing one's choice increasingly made at the expense of the other. Since definitions are differentially exemplified in any given society, we can ask the extent to which people think of themselves as tribes and to the extent to which they are organized as a caste society. Andre Bete says that there is no one way of defining tribes. Traditionally, tribe and peasantry were looked upon as mutually exclusive categories, but this is, as we know, is a false dichotomy. Historically, many tribes in central India, eastern India, like Santhals, Bhils, Oraons and Mundas, have been settled agriculturists for generations. Their members are classified as cultivators, agricultural laborers, and even as workers in primary occupations. Therefore, we can say that there is a lot of overlap between the two categories, and in the above cases, the tribes are categorized as a community of peasants. Now, understanding the tribes as segmentary systems will not be of much practical use, says Andre Bete, in a country like India, where segmentary societies cannot be identified. Tribal societies are societies which are generally small, but they are also numerous. They are also large in number. For example, in the case of Santals, in some tribal villages there exists a division of labor. They are less stratified. Often a single tribe such as the Bhils or Gonds turn out to be aggregates of many sections. Some a part of the Bhils and the Gonds, some of them are peasants while others are not. So the agrarian context then allows for a merging of caste and tribes, where the base consists of a heterogeneous body of peasants which are subdivided into ethno-linguistic categories. It was Verrier Elwin, an Englishman and an Anglican missionary, who forcefully argued for a recognition of the separate social and cultural identity of the tribal people. Now, having worked amongst the tribals for many years, Verrier Elwin tried to make tribal cultures visible, worthy of respect, and deserve special attention of the authorities for receiving welfare. It is said that he even influenced Nehru for a good number of measures pertained to the tribals. The government of India today gives tacit recognition to this identity by instituting a special category of scheduled castes under the Constitution of India. We come to the third aspect, a very important aspect, namely tribes as indigenous people. Should tribes be considered as indigenous or not? The term indigenous was used for the first time in 1957. It gained popularity after 1993, was designated as the International Year of the Indigenous People by the ILO. Now, in 1957, the International Labour Organization, ILO, had adopted a convention regarding the protection and integration of the indigenous people with their respective nation states. The international organization even laid down certain actions to be undertaken by the governments to facilitate integration. But subsequently in 1985, the ILO revised its proposal following changing attitudes towards the tribals worldwide. Integration as a goal gave way to a larger recognition of the rights of indigenous and the tribal people. The emphasis was to encourage tribal people to recognize and celebrate and retain their identities, participate in activities which affect their way of life. Now, according to this, three aspects have been central to the conceptualization of indigeneity. Firstly, the indigenous people are those that lived in this country before colonization and conquest by people from outside the country or geographical region. Secondly, they have become marginalized as a result of the conquest by people from outside. Thirdly, indigenous people have their own social, economic and cultural institutions that govern their lives rather than laws applicable to the society at large. These are the three dimensions which are integral to the conceptualization of indigeneity. Virginius Kaka highlighted that a distinction is being made between the indigenous people and the tribal people. The indigenous people are seen as victims of conquests and colonization from outside the region. The outsiders then are clearly identifiable. In the Indian conquest, the usage of the term Adivasi or indigenous people is quite common, and it has been in circulation for a long time. The term has been commonly used to refer to the tribal people by scholars, missionaries, social workers, academics, and so on. At that time, the political dimension associated with the use of the term indigenous was not quite clear, was not assumed. Therefore, when the political dimension came to be associated with this term, and it became a term to describe and designate certain category of people, Then this internationalization of the term brought about a close scrutiny of whether tribes in India could be termed as indigenous or not. Virginis Khaka again dwells on the arguments around the idea of designating tribes as indigenous or not. For example, in India, unlike in America or in Australia or New Zealand, tribes have not been subject to conquest and colonization, and therefore in identification of indigenous people is not really easy. There have been further in India considerable movement of people with different language, race, culture and religion dating back to centuries. Now, given this situation, how far back do we go to determine who are the natives and who are the immigrants? Secondly, tribes in India have been living in close proximity with the non-tribal people for over centuries, which has led to a process of acculturation and assimilation into the larger Hindu society. This is different from that of the New World, where the tribal-non-tribal encounter was marked by conquest and subjugation. Therefore, the Indian experience does not really conform to the one that is commonly assumed. Thirdly, there is a confusion regarding the cutoff date. Can the tribals be regarded as original inhabitants, especially when tribal traditions mention repeatedly the migration of their ancestors? In different parts of India, the settlement patterns of tribes have been different. For example, in the northeast, tribes like Naga and Mizo have come much later to settle than the non-tribal population. Therefore, it cannot be said that all tribal people in India are all early settlers before the coming of the Aryans. However, in certain places like Mizoram, the Mizos who they might have come in later than the non-tribal population, but they were the earliest of settlers. So, they are truly indigenous to Mizoram. So, therefore, these kinds of debates, discussions, contestations exist as to whether the tribes can be considered as indigenous people. Virginis Khaka, of course, says that tribes should be considered as indigenous people despite these contestations, because it is only a section of the tribals who face this conundrum, in the sense that most of them have lived in India, whereas only some have come later than the Aryans. Even after 75 years of independence, what is the condition of tribals in India today? According to a study undertaken by the Pratichi Trust in 2020, recently published, it is seen that the tribals in India experience marginalization, experience deprivation as compared to other sections, other deprived sections, namely the Dalits and the minorities. The social arrangements are such that the opportunities to acquire education, the opportunities to ensure good health, the opportunity to participate in academic and policy discussions are non-existent among Adivasis. Though there are certain public policies have been undertaken and the reservation policy is in place, the tribals experience a kind of precarity, kind of insecurity as far as their education, healthcare, opportunities is concerned. In fact, the functioning of public provisioning is quite inadequate, and therefore tribals face neglect, they face alienation, they experience a kind of voicelessness, and therefore they cannot participate in the mainstream. Now, in another context, I will just mention how tribes articulate their identity, and that is, this is a study by Nilambar Chetri among the tribes of ethnic groups of Darjeeling, where tribes assert themselves through ethnic associations, and they have claimed the scheduled tribe status by moving away from Hinduism and going back to their animistic beliefs, constructing ethno-histories, rejuvenating their tribal dialects, all in an attempt to establish their tribal roots and identities and put forward their claims as part of the ST status in front of the government officials.